Once upon a time I had my life planned out. A part of it anyway. The first half I wasn't clear on, but at the stroke of 50 I was all set to turn into a wonderful woman. A wife to a doctor, or a vicar's wife, chairman of the parish council, the pillar of the Women's Institute, a wise, witty, and ultimately white-haired old lady who's always stood on her own feet. Until one morning she comes out of the county library at the age of 80, falls under the weight of her improving book, breaks her hip, and dies peacefully, continently, and without fuss, under a snowy coverlet of the cottage hospital. And coming away from her funeral, in a country churchyard on a bright winter's afternoon, people would say, well, she was a wonderful woman. Had this been a serious ambition, I should have seen to it that I was equipped with the skills necessary to its accomplishment. How to produce jam which, after a good rolling boil, successfully coats the spoon. How to whip up a Victoria sponge that just gives to the fingertips. How to plan, execute and carry through a successful garden fete. All weapons in the armoury of any upstanding Anglican lady. But I can do none of these things. I'm even a fool at the flower arrangement. I ought to have a PhD in the subject, the number of classes I've taken. But still, my efforts show as much evidence of art as walking sticks in an umbrella stand. Actually, it's temperament. I don't have it. If you think squash is a competitive activity, try flower arrangement. On this particular morning, the rota has Miss Frobisher and Mrs. Belcher down to do the side aisles, while I'm paired with Mrs. Shrubsole to do the altar and the lectern. My honest opinion, never voiced, needless to say, is that if they were really sincere about religion, they'd forget flower arrangement altogether, invest in some permanent plastic jobs, and put the money towards the current most popular firman. However, round mid-morning, I wander over to the church with a couple of dog-eared chrysanthemums. Well, they look as if they could do with an immediate drink. So I call in at the vestry to root out a vase or two from the cupboard where Geoffrey keeps the communion wine. It not looming very large on my horizon, I assume I'm doing the altar and Mrs. Shrubsole the lectern. But when I come out of the vestry, Mrs. S. is at the altar, well embarked on her arrangement. I said I thought I was doing the altar. No, I think Mrs. Belcher will bear me out. I'm down to do the altar, you're doing the lectern. Why? She smiles sweetly. Do you have a preference? The only preference I have is to shove my chrysanthemums up her nose. But instead, I practice a bit of Christian forbearance and go stick them in a vase by the lectern. In the best tradition of my floral arrangements, they look like the poles of a wigwam. So I go and see if I can catch a bit of backing from Mrs. Belcher. Are you using this, I say, picking up a bit of mouldy old fern? I certainly am. I need every bit of my sparria. It gives it body. I go over to Miss Frobisher to see if she has any greenery going begging. Only she's doing some Japanese number. A vase like a test tube, half filled with gravel, in which she's throttling a lone carnation. So I retire to the vestry to calm my shattered nerves. And when I come out, ready to tackle my croissants again, Mrs. Shrubsole has apparently finished, and fetched the other two up to the altar to admire her handiwork. So I wander up and take a look. Well, it's a brown job. Beech leaves, teasels, grass, that school of thought. Mrs. Shrubsole was saying, it's called Forest Murmurs. It's what I did for my highly commended in Harrogate. What do you think? Gert and Daisy are, of course, speechless with admiration. But when I tentatively point out that it might look a bit better if she cleared up all the bits and pieces lying around, she said, "What bits and pieces?" I said, "These acorns and fir cones and whatnot. What's this conqueror made of?" She said, "Leave that. The whole arrangement. Pivots on that." I said, "Pivots?" When the adjudicator was commenting on my arrangement, he particularly singled out the hint I gave of the forest floor. I said, "Mrs. Shrapsell, this is the altar of St. Michael and All Angel. It is not the wind and the willows." "I think you ought to sit down," says Mrs. Belcher. I said, "I do not want to sit down. It's all very well transforming the altar into something out of Banby. But do not forget that for the vicar, the altar is his working surface. Furthermore," I added, "should the vicar sink to his knees in prayer, which since this is the altar he is wont to do, he is quite likely to get one of those teasel things in his eye. This is not a flag arrangement. It is a booby trap, a help hazard. In fact, I say in a moment of supreme inspiration, it ought to be labelled house floor. Permit me to demonstrate." And I begin to get to my knees, just to prove how lethal our bloody forest manners is. Only I must have slipped, because next thing I know I'm rolling down the altar steps and end up banging my head against the communion rail. Mrs. Shrapsell, who along with every other organisation known to man has been in the St. John's Ambulance Brigade, wants me left lying down, whereas Mrs. Belcher is all for getting me onto a chair. Leave them lying down and they inhale their own vomit. It happens all the time, Veronica. Only Muriel, says Mrs. Belcher, says Mrs. Shrapsell, when they have vomited. She hasn't vomited. No, I say, but I will if I have to listen to any more of this drivel and begin to get up. "Is that blood, Veronica?" says Mrs. Belcher, pointing to my head. "Well," says Mrs. Shrapsell, "it could be, I suppose," reluctant to concede to Mrs. B on any matter remotely touching medicine. "What we need is some hot, sweet tea." "I thought that theory had been discredited," says Mrs. Belcher. Discredited or not, it sends Miss Frobisher streaking off to find a tea bag, and, as it subsequently transpires, to telephone all and sundry in an effort to locate Geoffrey. He is in York, attending the usual interdenominational conference on the role of the church in some hitherto uncolonised department of life, underfloor central heating possibly. He comes haring back, thinking I'm at death's door, and finding I'm not, has nothing more constructive to offer than I take a nap. This gives the green light to the fan club to invade the vicarage, making endless tea and the vicar's lunch and, as he puts it, spoiling him rotten. Since this also licenses them to conduct a fact-finding survey as to the housekeeping arrangements, or absence of same. Where does she keep the curate, vicar? A good time had by all. Meanwhile, Emily Bronte is laid out on the sofa in a light doze. I come round to hear Geoffrey saying, "Mrs. Shrapsell is going now, darling." I don't get up. I never even open my eyes. I just wave and say, "Goodbye, Mrs. Shrapsell." Only thinking about it as I drift off again, I may have said, "Goodbye, Mrs. Subsoil." Anyway, I meant the other Shrapsell. When I woke up, it was dark, and Geoffrey had gone out. I couldn't find a thing in the cupboards, so I got the car out and drove into Leeds. I sat in the shop for a bit, not saying much. And then I felt a bit wonny, and Mr. Anesh let me go into the back place to lie down. I must have dozed off, because when I woke up, Mr. Ramesh has come in and started taking off his clothes. I said, "What are you doing? What about the shop?" He said, "Do not worry about the shop. I have closed the shop." I said, "But it's only 9. You don't close until 11. He said, "I do tonight." I said, "What's tonight?" He said, "A chance in a million." I turn up for the books. Will you take your clothes off, please?